This is the disturbing archaeology iceberg. Tier 1. The Screaming Mummy. Imagine opening a royal coffin that's more than 3,000 years old. You expect the usual setup. A carefully wrapped body, calm expression, maybe some gold. Instead, you find a man with his mouth wide open, head tilted back, arms bound, and his body wrapped in animal skin. He looks frozen in the middle of a scream. This mummy was discovered in 1886 by French archaeologist Gaston Maspero. He labeled it Unknown Man E, though most people now know him as the Screaming Mummy. What stood out immediately was how wrong the burial was. He wasn't treated like royalty at all. He was wrapped in sheepskin, which ancient Egyptians considered impure and unholy. His organs were left inside him instead of being removed and preserved, and his body was tied down and placed into the coffin with none of the care normally given to someone of high status. Early researchers struggled to explain what they were seeing. The open mouth and strained posture led to dramatic ideas about how he died. Over time, though, modern medical scans gave a clearer picture. CT scans showed damage to his neck consistent with strangulation. His lungs were also overinflated, which fits with death by asphyxiation. Whatever happened to him, it happened before burial. DNA testing later pointed to a likely identity. The man was probably Prince Pentawere, a son of Pharaoh Ramesses III. Ancient court records describe a plot to assassinate the pharaoh, led by one of his wives and supported by Pentawere. The plot failed. Those involved were put on trial, and Pentawere was ordered to take his own life. The punishment didn't end there. In ancient Egypt, proper mummification was essential for the soul's survival in the afterlife. Pentawere was denied that. His burial was meant to strip him of identity and status. His name was removed from inscriptions, and his body was handled in a way meant to block any chance of spiritual continuation. It was a deliberate attempt to erase him. That plan didn't quite work out. His body was later moved into a hidden cache meant to protect royal mummies from tomb robbers. Ironically, the same cache also held the mummy of Ramesses III. The son who was punished for taking part in his father's murder ended up stored right beside him. So instead of disappearing, Pentawere became impossible to ignore. His burial is now one of the most discussed cases in Egyptian archaeology. Jerking off man. There is a glass case in a museum in Naples that holds a plaster cast of a man from Pompeii. He's lying on his back, with one hand resting right on his male parts. The internet did what it always does and turned it into one big joke. You've probably seen pictures calling him the guy who died jerking off, or saying he went out with a bang. But that's just the meme version. What you're actually looking at is a real person who died in one of the worst ways imaginable. His hands didn't end up on his groin because of pleasure. It ended up there because his muscles locked up while his body was being cooked alive. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius exploded. It sent out a wave of burning gas and ash called a pyroclastic surge. This surge moved faster than a speeding car, and temperatures inside reached roughly 300 to 500 degrees Celsius, or about 570 to 930 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hotter than your oven at full blast. When the surge hit Pompeii, it knocked this man off his feet and killed him in under a second. The heat was so extreme, it likely broiled his brain inside his skull almost instantly. He died faster than his brain could even register pain. When a human body is exposed to that kind of heat, the muscles seize up and contract hard. Scientists call it the pugilistic pose. The arms bend, the legs curl, and the body tightens like a boxer mid-fight. In this case, one of his hands ended up near his crotch. After he died, ash buried him completely. Over centuries, that ash hardened into stone, while his flesh and bones slowly decayed, leaving an empty space shaped exactly like his body. When archaeologists uncovered it, they poured liquid plaster into the cavity. Once it set, it captured his final position perfectly. So now he's permanently frozen in the moment he died, stuck in a pose that the internet, predictably, finds funny. Ötzi's mummy. You're hiking through the Alps, just below a ridge, when your boot knocks against something hard in the ice. At first you think it's a stick, but when the snow clears you see skin, then a face. And that's when you realize there's a human body frozen into the ground. In 1991, two hikers stumbled across a frozen body in the Alps. He'd later be named Ötzi, after the Ötztal Alps where he was found. The hikers called the police, and everyone assumed it was just a modern-day accident. The experts figured he'd been trapped by a storm, frozen solid, and that was that. But they were totally wrong. Carbon dating tests proved this was not a modern hiker. The guy had been dead for 5,300 years. That makes him the oldest natural mummy ever found in Europe. For a decade, he was just a famous frozen guy. But in 2001, a new scan changed everything. It turned a cool mummy discovery into an ancient murder case. The scan found a flint arrowhead buried deep in his left shoulder. It cut straight into a major artery near his collarbone. He also had defensive cuts on his hands and big bruises. That means he didn't freeze by accident. Someone hunted him down, fought him, and executed him. Scientists used his injuries to piece together his final hours, and it turns out it didn't start on the mountain. A few days earlier, he'd already been in trouble. Cuts on his hands looked like defensive wounds, the kind you get when you try to block a knife, which suggests he'd been in a fight and barely got away. After escaping, he climbed higher up the mountain, and at some point he must have thought the danger had passed. His stomach tells that part of the story. When researchers examined it, they found it packed with undigested goat meat and bread. That means he sat down and ate a full meal less than an hour before he died. You don't stop to cook and eat like that if you think someone is still after you. But the danger wasn't over. While he was on that slope, someone came up behind him. They shot an arrow into his back from a distance. It smashed his shoulder blade and hit the artery. That wound alone would have killed him in minutes as he bled out. But the attacker didn't leave it at that. They walked up to the dying man and ripped the arrow shaft out of his back. They left the stone tip inside, but they took the wooden stick. Maybe they wanted to reuse the arrow, or maybe they were trying to hide the evidence. Whatever the case, the man died on the spot. His corpse froze solid and stayed there for 5,000 years. We still don't know who killed him or why they did it, but we know it was personal. Ötzi was carrying a copper axe. Back then, a copper axe was like carrying a Ferrari in your pocket. It was super valuable, but the killer didn't steal it. They left the treasure right next to the body. So either they didn't care about the loot, or this wasn't about loot at all. Today, Ötzi lies in a frozen room in a museum in Italy, preserved for centuries, so we can still study him and the violent world he lived in. The Grauballe Man. You're digging in a muddy swamp for peat when your shovel hits something soft. You clear the mud and realize it's a man's face staring up at you. Well, not staring exactly, because he's dead. At first you think it's a fresh murder, but it's not. It's a crime from the Iron Age. The body you just found came to be known as the Grauballe Man. He was discovered in 1952, but tests showed he had actually died over 2,000 years ago. The swamp had acted like a natural time capsule. The water had no oxygen and the soil was full of acid. This combination created a chemical reaction that stopped his body from rotting. His skin went dark and leathery, his hair changed color, and his fingerprints survived. Police experts could even take prints, which is impressive considering he lived long before most written history. The most telling detail was his throat. The cut was clean and extremely deep. It sliced through his skin, muscle, windpipe, and blood vessels in one motion. Aside from the cut, there were no other injuries caused by a weapon. That tells us this was a professional execution. He was likely kneeling. The killer stood behind him, pulled his head back, and cut his throat in a single movement. He would have lost consciousness in seconds as blood stopped reaching his brain. After he died, his body was placed carefully into the bog, flat and face down. The care and placement shows this was deliberate, a ceremony of some kind. Most experts agree it was a human sacrifice. The villagers probably offered his life to the swamp gods for good crops or better weather. Or maybe he was a criminal paying the ultimate price. Either way, the whole village likely agreed to it. The Qilakitsoq Baby. In 1972, on the icy cliffs of northwest Greenland, two brothers named Hans and Joachim Gronwald were hunting birds near some old ruins when they stumbled across a pile of rocks that looked like a grave. They looked inside and found 8 bodies stacked on top of each other. The 8 people belonged to the Thule culture, who are the ancestors of modern Inuit people. They lived way back around the year 1475, when the temperature was freezing and life was extremely hard. There were 6 women and 2 kids who had been naturally preserved by the weather. Because the air in the cave was so cold and dry, it basically freeze-dried their bodies. It happened so perfectly that their hair, skin, and even eyebrows were still there. The most shocking of the 2 children was a 6-month-old baby boy. He looked so fresh, the humans actually thought he was a plastic doll. The adult women died from health issues, and the other child, a 4-year-old boy, had Down syndrome and a hip disease. But the baby was totally different. He was healthy and still alive when he was put in the grave. Turns out the problem wasn't the baby's body. His mother had died, and at that time and place, a baby simply couldn't survive without her. No one else had milk to feed him. Inuit tradition also dictate that a child should travel to the afterlife with the mother so she could care for him. If the villagers kept him alive, he would have just starved. So the family faced a grim choice. They could leave him in the village to slowly die of starvation, Or they could place him in the grave with his mother and let the cold take over. They chose the grave. The adults wrapped him in warm clothing, laid him against his mother's body, and sealed the stones. At first, the baby would not have felt pain because his parka trapped heat, but the cold always wins. He likely grew tired, drifted to sleep as his body temperature dropped, and his heart eventually stopped. He probably passed away peacefully in his sleep. Rosalia Lombardo. There's a small glass coffin in a museum in Palermo, Italy. Inside is a little girl in a silk dress with golden hair and soft cheeks. The nameplate reads Rosalia Lombardo. Some people call her the best preserved child mummy in the world. Others call her the girl who blinks. At first glance, she looks like she's just asleep. But when the lights shift in the room, something strange happens. Her eyelids seem to move. For a split second, you can see her blue eyes. Then they look closed again. And that's usually the moment that makes people lose their minds. Rosalia died in 1920, just before her second birthday. The cause was pneumonia, which back then was a brutal illness that killed huge numbers of children. Her father couldn't accept losing her, so he hired an embalmer named Alfredo Salafia and asked him to preserve her body so she would never decay. Salafia injected Rosalia with a chemical mixture designed to kill bacteria and stop mold. The key ingredient was zinc, which hardened her body and essentially froze it in time. She became stiff, almost statue-like. He didn't remove her organs. Everything stayed inside. The result was phenomenal. Her face stayed perfectly round, and her skin remained smooth. Even her lips and eyelashes looked exactly like they did when she was alive. Decades later, X-rays showed her organs were still intact. She didn't rot the way bodies usually do, and she didn't really look dead. She looked like she was asleep. Salafia's work gave Rosalia's father a lot of comfort, so he moved her to the Capuchin catacombs in Palermo where he could visit her. Over time, visitors noticed something strange. Her eyelids were never fully closed. They were fixed slightly open, and as sunlight shifted through the room during the day, it hit her blue eyes at different angles. To some people, it looked like they were moving. The nickname the Blinking Mummy came much later. Long after Rosalia's death, videos of her spread online, and modern viewers started freaking out. YouTube clips went viral, and paranormal blogs ran wild. Eventually, the monks who managed the catacombs placed her in a sealed glass case filled with nitrogen gas to stop mold and further decay. The new enclosure removed the shifting light and showed she wasn't blinking at all. But by then, it didn't really matter. Once the internet decides something is haunted, facts don't stand much of a chance. Tier 2. Mummy Paint. In 1964, inside a paint factory in London, a manager named Geoffrey Robertson Park made a business announcement to Time magazine. He said his company was discontinuing one of its most popular colors because they'd run into a supply problem. That product was called Mummy Brown. For about 400 years, European artists used it to paint shadows and warm tones because it had a deep, earthy richness other pigments couldn't match. Painters loved it. Collectors paid extra for it. The reason it looked that way is something you'd never see coming. It was made by grinding up actual Egyptian mummies. It sounds like a joke, but it wasn't. This was a real, respectable industry, and it all started because of a simple linguistic error. Back in the 12th century, European doctors found ancient texts praising a healing mineral called bitumen, but they mistranslated the word. They thought it referred to the black, sticky resin found inside Egyptian mummies. So instead of looking for minerals, they started grinding up preserved bodies and feeding them to sick people to fix broken bones. At some point, science caught up, and people finally figured out that eating preserved corpses wasn't exactly good for your health. But the supply chain didn't close down. It just changed customers. Painters realized that the same sticky resin-soaked powder that was bad for your stomach was perfect for creating transparent brown shadows on a canvas. To make this paint, manufacturers had to be picky about which parts of the mummy they used. You couldn't just throw the whole body into the grinder. The bones were too hard and made the paint gritty. The factories specifically wanted the fleshy parts, like the stomach and thighs. And then they added the dried muscle tissue mixed with ancient spices to make a smooth, buttery paste. For a while, the business was doing great, but eventually, even the biggest cemeteries ran dry. So the industry had to get creative with their sourcing. In 1890, a ship arrived in Liverpool carrying 19 tons of mummified cats. That is roughly 180,000 dead pets that were dug up in Egypt. Since the cats were wrapped in the same resins as the humans, they were just as useful. While the factories knew exactly what they were grinding, the artists usually didn't ask questions. A famous painter, Edward Burne-Jones, was so shocked when he realized he'd been painting with ground-up human corpses that he held a funeral for the paint in his backyard. He was the exception. Most artists just kept painting. Even though production stopped in the 1960s, the pigment didn't disappear. If you visit the Louvre Museum today, you'll see a painting called Interior of a Kitchen by Martin Drawling. The painting is breathtaking, so much so that if you didn't already know, you'd never guess the warm shadows in that cozy room are literally made of crushed human remains. But now you know, and you'll never be able to unsee it. The Polish Sickle. If you visit the Drosko village cemetery in Poland today, it looks like any other quiet graveyard with headstones and flowers. But a few feet below the surface, archaeologists found something that looked like it was ripped straight out of an Indiana Jones movie. They discovered graves from the 1600s and 1700s that had booby traps. Most graves in the area looked normal, but 6 of them were totally different. The bodies inside them had sharp iron sickles laid straight across their necks. The placement was intentional. If the person tried to sit up, the curved blade would press into their throat. It was meant to keep them from ever rising. The sickles weren't the only precautions. In some graves, heavy stones were packed under the chin to stop the mouth from opening. In others, coins were pushed deep inside the mouth. One man had even been buried face down, so if he somehow tried to dig his way out, he would only dig himself deeper into the soil. Taken together, the message is clear. The people who buried these bodies were deeply afraid of what might happen if they didn't take every possible step to keep the dead where they belong. You might think these people were criminals or weird strangers, but chemicals on the teeth showed they were actually locals. They were regular people who lived in the village. So why did their friends and families go to such extreme lengths to keep them buried? It all comes down to fear and timing. Archaeologists believe these burials happened during outbreaks of cholera or the plague, when people were dying suddenly and in pain. Death came fast, without warning, and no one understood why. As more people fell ill, fear spread through the villages. The first deaths caused the most panic. People believed those who died under strange or violent circumstances might return and bring the sickness back with them. In a world without medical explanations, that fear felt completely real. That fear shaped the way the dead were buried. Folk traditions said iron could block supernatural forces. It was believed to weaken spirits and stop them from moving. So villagers used what they trusted most: sharp farm tools, heavy stones, and metal objects. Every sickle and coin was placed with one goal in mind: making sure the dead stayed exactly where they were. Hand of Glory. In 1935, inside a cottage in Castleton, North Yorkshire in England, a stonemason named Joseph Ford was renovating a wall. He was tearing out old plaster when he hit a hollow space that shouldn't have been there. When he checked inside the gap, he found a withered black human hand. Most people would call the police, but Ford knew exactly what he was holding. He recognized it as a Hand of Glory. In European folklore, this is a piece of tactical equipment for thieves. The hand acts as a magical candle holder, or sometimes the hand is the candle. The belief was that lighting the fingertips would freeze everyone inside the house. Sleeping people would slip into a coma, and anyone still awake would be left completely paralyzed. It was basically a vintage time-stop trope. The problem, though, was that making one of these things was a lot harder than just robbing a house. According to a 1722 spellbook called The Petit Albert, you had to cut the right hand of a criminal while he was still hanging on the gallows. You then pickled the hand in a jar filled with salt, peppers, and the urine of a man, woman, dog, and horse. After 2 weeks of marinating in mixed pea and seasoning, you dried it in the sun. If you needed a candle for it, you made the wax from the hanged man's fat and the wick from his hair. It was a lot of effort for a flashlight. Today, that specific hand Joseph Ford found is sitting in the Whitby Museum. It is the only surviving specimen in the world. The Driffield Terrace Gladiators. Between 2004 and 2005, archaeologists began excavating a site called Driffield Terrace in York, northern England. The Romans, who ruled the area in the 4th century, called it Eboracum. They expected a normal cemetery, but instead they uncovered a mass grave containing over 80 young men, and a lot of them were missing their heads. These were not your average guys. They were absolutely jacked. Their bones proved they had huge muscles and old fractures from fighting. They also showed signs that they trained with heavy weapons. Most of them were taller and stronger than the locals at the time. Tests carried out on the bones showed the men came from different places, including North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. They all had different backgrounds, but the same bad ending. Every single one of them died violently. But one guy in particular stood out. Archaeologists labeled him 6DT19. His hip bone had deep puncture wounds. The size and spacing matched a lion's bite. Lions aren't native to Britain, which means this wasn't a random attack. The most likely explanation is that the Romans brought the lion all the way from Africa to an arena, where this man was forced to fight it for public entertainment. The lion didn't actually kill him. The bite hit his hip, not his chest or neck. It would have hurt like hell, but he survived it. He probably kept bleeding as the fight ended before being dragged out of the arena. For the final part, he was forced to kneel. Then, an executioner stood behind him and swung a heavy sword into the back of his neck. His head came off in one strike. After that, the burial crew placed his head between his knees before burying him. To this day, no one knows exactly who these men actually were, or why they were used, killed, and dumped into a pit instead of being given proper burials. Medieval coffin birth. In 2010, near the town of Imola in northern Italy, archaeologists dug up an old cemetery from the early Middle Ages. In one of the graves, they found the skeleton of a woman who was about 30 years old when she died. Her body was lying on her back, like most burials. But something was wrong. Between her legs were the tiny bones of a baby. It looked like this woman had somehow given birth after she died. Scientists call it coffin birth. This happens when the body of a pregnant woman starts to rot and build up gas inside. After some time, the gas pressure gets so intense that it literally pushes the baby out. In this case, the baby was not fully out. Only the head and upper body made it through. The mother died when she was about 38 weeks pregnant. But that's not the worst part. When researchers studied the woman's skull, they noticed something brutal. There was a small, round hole drilled right into the middle of her forehead while she was still alive. This was an ancient surgery called trepanation. Basically, they used a hand drill to bore a hole into her skull. It's proof that she was sick before she died, and someone tried to treat her. Based on what we know about medieval medicine, the woman was likely suffering from eclampsia. This is a condition where pregnancy causes extremely high blood pressure and seizures. She probably collapsed, convulsed, or lost consciousness. At the time, doctors didn't know how to treat that. One of the few treatments was to drill a hole in the skull, supposedly to release pressure or bad spirits, and then hope for the best. The skull shows signs of healing, which means she survived the procedure for several days before finally dying. To this day, we still do not know if the people who buried her even realized the baby had come out. The most likely theory is that the baby came out days after the funeral. So people buried a mother and her unborn child, and the rest happened in the dark. Tier 3. Frankenstein mummies. In 2001, on the island of Southeast in Scotland, archaeologists excavating beneath a Bronze Age roundhouse uncovered 2 human skeletons buried under the floor. One was positioned like a man, the other like a woman. At first, they seemed like ordinary burials, possibly preserved by the peat-rich local soil. Years later, DNA testing told a different story. The skeletons weren't 2 individuals at all. Each one had been pieced together from the remains of at least 3 separate people. The skeleton, identified as male, had a skull from one man, a jaw from another, and the rest of the body came from a third unrelated individual. The female skeleton was assembled the same way, using bones from at least 3 different women. As if things weren't complicated enough, scientists learned that the people these bones came from had died hundreds of years apart. This wasn't an accident. Someone built these bodies on purpose. It was a Bronze Age version of Frankenstein. But the thing is, you can't just stitch old dusty bones together because, well, they'd crumble. So the researchers looked closer and realized the bones were chemically preserved. It appears that this specific clan or family placed their dead relatives in a nearby peat bog for about 1 year. The bog acted like a giant jar of vinegar, which pickled the bodies so the skin and hair stayed on, and it also stopped them from rotting. After the pickling process was done, the family pulled the mummies out and kept them inside their houses for hundreds of years. They likely displayed them like statues, but even pickled bodies break down eventually. So when parts of the main ancestor mummy started to fall off, the family just swapped them out. If the mummy lost a jaw, they replaced it with a newer one. If a leg rotted away, they grabbed a fresh one from a different dead relative. If all of this is true, then it means the dead weren't just buried. They were stored, cared for, and occasionally they got upgrades. Then, centuries later, they were placed beneath a house and buried. We still don't know why any of this happened. Maybe the people who built these skeletons were honoring their ancestors. Maybe they believed stitching multiple together created some kind of extra powerful guardian spirit. Or maybe they just like keeping their loved ones close, dead or alive. Either way, we'll probably never know for sure. What we do know is that someone in the Bronze Age saw nothing weird about digging up Grandma, borrowing her leg, and giving it to Uncle Dave. The Scold's Bridle. If you walk into the National Museum of Scotland today, you will see a rusty metal cage sitting behind the glass. It looks like a piece of old armor, but when researchers dug into it, they realized it was something much darker. It was a torture device, created specifically for women. The design was super simple but incredibly painful. The cage locked onto a human head, and a small metal plate slid into the woman's mouth. This plate sat right on top of the tongue and had a sharp spike on it. If the person moved their tongue to speak or swallow, that spike stabbed them immediately. So the only way to not get hurt was to sit there and not make a single sound. If you hadn't figured it out just yet, yes, the authorities invented this thing to shut women up. One of the most famous cases of the bridle being used was on a woman named Elizabeth who lived in the town of Lanark in 1653. Elizabeth hadn't stolen anything, and she hadn't killed anyone. Her crime was talking too much. In 17th century Scotland, that was enough to label you a common scold, which is what people call someone whose opinions annoyed the wrong people back then. The courts couldn't legally silence her, so they reached for a workaround. They strapped her into the bridle. Once the mask clamped her jaw shut, she was paraded through the streets on a chain while officials followed behind ringing bells. That was a signal for the neighbors to come out and join in, hurling trash and insults as she passed. Sometimes the person holding the leash wasn't even an official. It was the victim's husband. The humiliation was the entire point. The goal was to break someone socially and make sure they never wanted to speak again. The Scold's Bridle stuck around for roughly 200 years before fading out in the 1800s, which means for an unsettling stretch of history, local governments actively spent money designing and maintaining torture devices to silence women. The Children of Llullaillaco. In 1999, archaeologists discovered the bodies of 3 children near the summit of Llullaillaco volcano on the Argentina-Chile border. One was a teenage girl around 13, who's now called the Maiden. Another was a younger girl, about 6, who we now know as Lightning Girl. And the third was a little boy, no more than 4 or 5. Their skin and hair were so well preserved, they looked like they had simply fallen asleep. In reality, they had been sitting there for over 500 years. The trio were taken up that mountain on purpose. The Inca people believed that sacrificing beautiful and healthy children would make the gods happy. So they picked these 3 kids and treated them like royalty for months. They fed them good food and gave them special clothes. Then they walked them up the mountain for a ceremony called capacocha. Once they reached the summit, the priests gave the children chicha, a fermented corn beer, along with coca leaves. The combination dulled fear and pain and left them sedated. When archaeologists later examined the maiden, they found a wad of chewed coca leaves still in her mouth. After that, the priests placed the children into shallow burial pits and left. The alcohol, the drugs, and the extreme cold did the rest. They lost consciousness and froze to death where they sat. The little boy's death seems to have been rougher. His body was tightly bound with rope, which suggests he may have woken up and panicked, or at least struggled. He also had vomit on his clothing, a sign he was likely suffering from altitude sickness before he died. The 6-year-old girl shows evidence of something even stranger. Sometime after she was buried, a lightning strike hit the mountain. The electrical current traveled through the ground and burned parts of her face and shoulder. Aside from that damage, her body is otherwise almost perfectly preserved. Today, all 3 children sit behind glass in a temperature-controlled museum in Argentina. Tier 4. The Neanderthal Feast. Imagine being trapped in a freezing Ice Age cave with your family and another group of strangers. Snow is burying everything outside. The fire is barely burning, and your stomach aches from days without real food. You're out of meat and out of options. Then you see the man who died yesterday. Nobody speaks. Suddenly, someone grabs a sharp stone and starts cutting into the body. He's about to be dinner. Archaeologists discovered this scene in 2001 at Goyet Cave, and it dates back to 45,000 years ago. Over 100 human bone fragments showed clear signs of butchery. Some had clean-cut marks where flesh was removed. Others were smashed to extract marrow, and a few were even reused as tools, like ribs for sharpening stone blades. All the cuts matched patterns seen on nearby butchered animal bones. But this time, the meat was human. DNA analysis revealed the victims weren't closely related to those doing the cutting. Most were women and children, suggesting this wasn't a desperate act by a single family. It looked like one group killed another and ate them. We don't know if the victims were prisoners, enemies, or just unlucky travelers. What we do know is that for a moment in the Ice Age, humans weren't just hunters. They were also dinner, tools, and fuel for the fire. The Prince Mauling. In 1942, Italian archaeologists working inside the Arene Candide cave found the skeleton of a teenage boy. He had been buried carefully in a pit and covered in ivory jewelry, pendants, and a decorated headdress. Because of how elaborate the burial was, they named him Il Principe, or the Prince. And for years, people assumed he was a celebrated young hunter who died with honor. But once researchers stopped looking at the burial and started looking at the body, things didn't quite add up. Recent forensic analysis showed his face had been shattered and his jaw torn away. One shoulder was crushed, and the top of his skull had collapsed inward. The damage was chaotic and uneven, nothing like the clean trauma left by weapons. There was also no pattern that matched ritual killing or human violence. Instead, the injuries lined up with something very specific: a bear attack, most likely a cave bear, a prehistoric species that could grow nearly twice the size of a modern grizzly. Considering he lived during the Ice Age, crossing paths with something like that was a real and very bad possibility. The worst part is that the attack didn't kill him right away. His throat and major arteries were untouched, and his bones show early signs of healing. That means he survived for another 2 or 3 days. During that time, he had a crushed shoulder, a damaged skull, and likely punctured lungs. Breathing would have been agony. Movement would have been worse. He eventually died from infection and blood loss while the people around him could do nothing but watch. When he finally died, the people around buried him with extreme care. It's not clear who exactly did it, but it was almost certainly his family or close members of his tribe. They covered his wounds with yellow ochre, a clay pigment, and placed hundreds of perforated shells and deer teeth across his body. For years, this burial confused researchers, but now they've come to the conclusion that the ornaments were not decorative. They were probably protective charms. The death was violent enough that his people may have believed something dangerous had followed him home. Burying him this way may have been an attempt to ward off whatever they thought killed him and to make sure it stayed gone. To this day, we still don't know how he ended up face to face with the bear. Maybe he wandered too far, or maybe he never even saw it coming. What we do know is that his final days were slow, painful, and terrifying. The Franklin Expedition. In 1845, the British Navy sent 2 massive ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, on a mission to find a shortcut to Asia by sailing straight through the Arctic ice. There were 129 men on board, and the expedition was loaded with what passed for cutting-edge technology at the time, along with enough food to last for years, so confidence was high, and the men genuinely believed nothing could go wrong. In the end, that confidence was misplaced. None of them ever made it home, and the entire expedition disappeared. By the winter of 1847, both ships were trapped in thick ice near King William Island in Canada. The ocean around them had frozen solid, so they did the only logical thing they could do, which was wait. They sat on those ships for about 1.5 years, waiting for summer to melt the ice. But the heat never came. To make things worse, their canned food was poorly made, and likely gave them lead poisoning. Life on board became a nightmare, and many men died while waiting on the ships. We don't know exactly how they handled those bodies, but we do know that the ground there is frozen solid like concrete, so digging proper graves was basically impossible. In April 1848, the rest of the survivors decided they couldn't wait anymore, so they abandoned the ships. They grabbed lifeboats and supplies and started dragging them across the ice. The plan was to walk hundreds of miles south to the Back River and find safety. But this walk is where things went from bad to horrific. The men were freezing and starving and dragging heavy sleds through the snow. As they walked, the food supplies ran out completely. Eventually, hunger beat their morals. Probably one survivor made a choice and used a knife to cut meat from a dead friend. He cooked it over a fire and ate it just to stay alive. That kept them going for a bit, but soon even that meat ran out. So they started smashing the bones open to eat the grease and fat inside. For years, nobody in England knew what was happening. In 1854, local Inuit hunters told search parties that they saw starving white men dropping dead while walking. They also said they saw the men cooking human flesh. They didn't want to believe that well-trained Navy officers could end up eating each other, because that shattered the idea that their heroes died with dignity. Science eventually cut through that denial. In 2015, researchers examined the bones and found evidence that couldn't be explained away. The ends of the thigh bones were smooth and shiny. This happens when a bone rubs against the inside of a metal pot while boiling in water for a long time. Archaeologists call it pot polish. That shine proves the men weren't just eating raw meat. They were cooking their crewmates in kettles to make the most of every meal. And not only that, some bones had knife marks from skinning. Others were smashed and splintered. The team also found skulls cracked open, most likely to reach the brain or soft tissues inside. The men who did this were officers and sailors trained to follow order and discipline. But after weeks without food and while watching the people around them die, those rules lost their meaning. What they did was driven by desperation and the need to survive a little longer. Dura-Europos chemical warfare. In 256 CE, near the Euphrates River in what is now Syria, the Roman Empire was trying to hold on to a fortress city called Dura-Europos. On the other side were the Sasanians, the Persian army, and they had a problem. The city walls were massive. Storming them head-on wasn't happening. So the Persians went underground. They started digging tunnels beneath the city walls, hoping to collapse them from below. The Romans figured this out pretty quickly and responded by digging their own tunnels to intercept the Persians before the damage was done. What followed was basically trench warfare, except it was happening in pitch-black tunnels under the city. Fast forward to the 20th century, when archaeologists excavated those tunnels, they came across something that didn't add up at first. In one narrow passageway, there were 20 bodies piled together, 19 Roman soldiers and 1 Persian. Finding bodies on a battlefield isn't unusual. The problem was how clean the bodies were. There were no sword cuts, no arrow wounds, and no signs of a fight. Just a pile of dead soldiers stacked in a confined space. At first glance, people assumed it was a normal tunnel collapse. The roof caved in. Everyone suffocated. End of story. That explanation held up for decades. Then, in the early 2000s, archaeologist Simon James took another look at the site and noticed details that didn't fit that theory. The tunnel wasn't just full of dirt. There were yellow sulfur crystals and black tar-like residue mixed into the soil. Lab tests showed the black material was bitumen. Those materials had no reason to be there from construction or mining. They were the remains of something that had been burned on purpose. Here's what scientists say happened. When the Romans broke through into the Persian tunnel, the Persian defenders set a fire using sulfur and bitumen. Burning that combination produces thick smoke and sulfur dioxide gas. In an enclosed tunnel with no airflow, that gas would have spread instantly. The Romans never had a chance. Sulfur dioxide burns the lungs and causes rapid suffocation. The soldiers would have collapsed within seconds, choking and panicking, trapped in a space with nowhere to run. The single Persian body found with them was probably the man who lit the fire. He may not have escaped in time, or he was caught in the initial rush before the gas fully spread. Either way, he died alongside the men he helped kill. Afterward, Persian troops returned to the tunnel and stacked the Roman bodies together, using them to block the passage completely. This ensured that no Roman counterattack would come through that route. The Romans never knew what hit them. As far as we know, this is the earliest documented case of chemical warfare. It happened centuries before modern gas weapons, mask, or military doctrines. And it worked. Not long after, the Persians captured Dura-Europos. The remaining population was either killed or enslaved, and the city was abandoned. Everything stayed buried in place, including the tunnels, the bodies, and the residue from the smoke, until archaeologists uncovered it centuries later. Tier 5. The Herxheim Pit. Imagine you're a farmer living in Europe about 7,000 years ago. You belong to a crew called the Linear Pottery Culture, and you guys were the first real farmers in the region. For a long time, life works. Then around 5000 BC, the climate shifts. Crops start failing and everything comes apart. Villagers turn on each other. Food runs out, and whatever social order existed collapses. At a settlement called Herxheim in modern-day Germany, that breakdown took a much darker turn. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found a deep double ditch encircling the village. The ditch wasn't the shocking part. It was what was inside. Piles of heads, arms, and ribs, all tangled together. At least 500 people were identified, though experts think the real number was over 1,000. It was like a butcher's dumpster, only 7,000 years old and far more terrifying. When researchers looked closer at the bones, things got even darker. The damage was totally systematic. The cut marks were in the exact same spots on every single body. This proves the people of Herxheim were not just hacking up their victims during a fight. They were taking these bodies apart like professionals. First, the Herxheim villagers peeled the skin off the victim's head so they could crack the skulls open and eat the brains. Then they cut the tongues right out of the victims' mouths. After that, they smashed the heavy leg bones to suck out the nutritious marrow inside. It was so gruesome that scientists actually found chew marks on some of the victims' finger bones. They even recycled the top part of the skulls to use them as drinking cups. When scientists tested the victims' teeth, they realized these people were not locals. Entire families had been captured and brought from the mountains far away to Herxheim just to be eaten. Now, you might think the villagers only did this because they were starving. That's actually not true. Animal bones found nearby show they still had plenty of normal food. Also, the number of bodies is way too high for just hunger. Researchers think this was a ritual. The Herxheim villagers were terrified that their world was ending. They probably thought eating outsiders would give them power or save them from the collapse. Obviously, that magic didn't work. But it does explain why the villagers went out of their way to kidnap around 1,000 strangers and eat them instead of just leaving. The Sewer of Ashkelon. In 1988, archaeologists digging under a Roman-style bathhouse in Ashkelon, Israel, made a shocking discovery. The city was a major center back then, and the bathhouse was a place where people came to relax. While clearing a clogged sewer tunnel, they uncovered a pile of bones. These were human remains. Almost 100 newborn babies. The bodies were packed in with broken pottery, food scraps, and animal waste. As the team investigated further, the scene became even more disturbing. Usually, skeletons found in a sewer are scattered and broken because water and rats move them around. These skeletons were different. They were still in the shape of human bodies. That shows the babies were dumped while fresh and never moved again. After the excavation, the team sent the bones to labs for testing. Experts confirmed all of them were newborns, most just a few days old. Even though they did not have visible teeth, they had teeth growing inside their jaws, and those hidden teeth told the whole story. Teeth grow in layers, just like rings on a tree. When a baby is born, it is a huge shock to the body, so it leaves a dark line on the tooth. It is basically a permanent timestamp that says, "I was born today." But here's the sad part. These babies had the timestamp, but zero growth after it. This proves they were born alive and healthy. They took their first breath, and then, almost immediately, someone made sure it was their last. At first, historians assumed most of the victims were girls. In Roman society, fathers often rejected daughters because they were expensive to marry off, so they left them outside to die. It was a brutal practice called exposure. But when DNA tests were done on 43 of the babies, 14 of them were confirmed male. Since they could not test out every single bone due to damage, the ratio implies that a huge chunk of the victims were male. That result flipped the entire story on its head. So why would someone mass murder baby boys? Well, the leading theory is that this bathhouse was actually a front for a brothel. In that line of work, a baby girl could be raised to become a worker like her mother. She was seen as an investment, but a baby boy was just another mouth to feed who could not do the job, so they were disposed. Some historians disagree with that theory. They argue that professional night workers in ancient Rome knew how to use herbs and tools to prevent pregnancy, so it seems unlikely they would have had this many unwanted children. Archaeologists think the sewer was probably just a city dump. We'll never know exactly what happened or why these children were killed, but whatever the reason, it's a disturbing glimpse into the past. The Huanchaco Sacrifice. Imagine you're a kid in the Chimu Empire in Peru, about 550 years ago. Rain is pouring harder than you've ever seen, and the adults are panicking. They paint your face with red powder and lead you out to a muddy field near the ocean. Around you, dozens of other children are walking, and hundreds of llamas are crowded in too. You don't know it yet, but none of you are going home. In 2011, archaeologists excavated this spot under a dried mud dune near Huanchaco. They uncovered the remains of 140 children and 200 llamas, all killed the same way. Their chests had been cut open and their hearts removed. The timing of it makes sense once you look at the mud. Northern Peru is usually a desert, so the thick layer of mud covering the site shows that something wasn't quite right. Experts think there was a massive El Niño storm around that time, the kind that destroyed crops, wiped out fish along the coast, and flooded entire towns. The Chimu people were facing disaster, and the rulers thought it was because the gods were punishing them. So they tried to make things right by offering their children and llamas. The sacrificed children weren't slaves or war captives. Their bones show they ate well, and their skull shapes match regions across the Chimu Empire. These were likely the sons and daughters of the elite sent here on purpose. Before the ritual, their faces were painted with a bright red powder, after which they were marched out. The ground was so wet that day that it preserved the footprints. You can still see where the children walked to the edge of the pit. Some footprints show the kids walking calmly, but others show heels digging into the mud, meaning some of the children had to be dragged to their deaths. Then comes the sacrifice part. The priests didn't go for the throat. They went straight to the chest. Using a sharp blade, they sliced through the middle of the chest and snapped the breastbone in half. Then, they pulled the ribs apart and took the heart out while it was likely still beating. And since the llamas were also considered valuable, they got the exact same treatment. After that, the bodies were buried in neat rows. All the children faced the sea, while the llamas faced the mountains. The Carthage Sacrifice. In the 1970s, archaeologists were digging on the edge of ancient Carthage near modern-day Tunis in Tunisia. Back then, Carthage was kind of like the New York City of the ancient world. It was huge, rich, and powerful, with trade networks stretching across the Mediterranean. While excavating near the old city center, researchers stumbled onto something disturbing. A large open field filled with rows of strange clay urns. The site later became known as the Tophet. When the urns were opened, they contained thousands of tiny burned bones. Most belonged to infants and small children, but some were identified to be from young animals like goats. As digging continued, it became clear this wasn't a one-time event. The urns were stacked in layers that built up over more than 600 years. Naturally, the sheer amount of bodies raised an obvious question. What exactly happened here? Carthage already had a reputation in the ancient world. Roman writers claimed the Carthaginians sacrificed their own children to the gods, burning them alive in exchange for success in war or good harvests. For a long time, modern historians dismissed those stories as propaganda. Rome hated Carthage, so the assumption was that they were exaggerating to make their enemy look like monsters. Under that view, the Tophet was explained away as a cemetery for infants who died of illness. That explanation held up for decades. Then scientists took a closer look, and the evidence started pointing in a very different direction. The evidence came from the bones themselves. When you burn a dry skeleton that has been dead for a while, the bones crack in a certain way. But when you burn a body that still has flesh and muscles on it, the heat does something different. It makes the bones warp and shrink. The bones in these jars show deep warping, which proves the children were still alive or extremely fresh when they were placed in the fire. Then there's the writing on the jars. Inscriptions don't say "rest in peace" or "we miss you." Instead, they thank the gods Tanit and Baal for answering prayers. Basically, these deaths were a transaction. The parents were paying the gods with, well, their kids' lives. According to ancient records, the ritual was extremely brutal. The Carthaginians built a giant bronze statue of the god Baal, holding his hands flat over a fire pit. The priests would light a massive fire underneath until the bronze glowed red. Drums and flutes played loudly to cover the child's screams. Then the child was placed on the scorching metal hands. When that much heat hits a human body, biology takes over. The extreme temperature cooks the tendons and muscles instantly. This causes them to shrink and pull tight. The arms and legs snap inward, making the body curl up into a ball. Scientists call this the pugilistic pose, which should sound familiar if you remember the Vesuvius Man. The heat did the same to the babies' faces, pulling muscles tight, stretching the lips, and exposing the teeth. It looked like the baby was grinning, which earned the nickname Laughing Death, but it was just the heat at work. In the end, the child fell into the fire pit below. All that remained was bones and ash. The priests collected the remains, sealed them in an urn, buried it, and placed a stone on top. The ritual was done. We still don't know if every urn held a sacrificed child. Some could be natural deaths, but over 20,000 urns have been found. And with that many bodies showing clear signs of burning, the evidence is hard to ignore. That's the end of the disturbing archaeology iceberg. If you found this interesting, unsettling, or even if it just made you pause for a second longer than you expected, you know what to do. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.